My name doesn't really matter anymore. At my age, names fade faster than faces. What stays are the moments, the quiet ones, the ones you replay when the house is finally still. I'm 78 years old as I tell this. I live alone now, in a small white house with blue shutters at the edge of a town most people pass without noticing. There's a maple tree in the front yard I planted the year my first child was born. It's taller than the house now. I suppose that's how time works. It keeps growing even when you think everything else has stopped. I didn't plan to tell this story. For most of my life, I believed some things were better left alone, that if you stayed quiet long enough, the past would eventually lose interest in you. I was wrong. People like to imagine grandparents as gentle figures who lived simple, happy lives, cookies in the oven, photo albums on the coffee table, advice offered softly and only when asked. That wasn't my life, not entirely. This story is about a decision I made in my 40s, a decision that followed me into old age, a decision my family still doesn't fully understand, and maybe they never will. But I remember it clearly, every day of it. I grew up in the late 1950s in a working-class neighborhood where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors knew the sound of your footsteps. My father worked at a paper mill. My mother stayed home and stretched every dollar until it almost broke. We didn't talk much about feelings. You worked, you ate, you slept, and you kept going. I married young, 21. That's what you did back then if someone asked and seemed steady enough. My husband, Robert, was kind in the way men were taught to be kind in those days. He showed up, he paid bills, he didn't ask many questions. We had 2 children, a boy first, then a girl 4 years later. I loved them fiercely, but quietly. I believed love was something you proved by staying, not by talking. For years, our life followed a predictable rhythm: work, school, church on Sundays, family dinners where everyone sat in the same chair every night. I can still see it if I close my eyes. But life rarely breaks all at once. It cracks slowly, hairline fractures you ignore because everything still looks solid from a distance. The first crack came the year my son turned 17. He changed that year, not in a dramatic way. He didn't run away or get into trouble with the law. It was smaller than that. He stopped talking at dinner. He spent more time in his room. When I asked how school was, he'd shrug. When his father asked about college, he'd leave the room. I told myself it was normal. Boys grow quiet before they grow independent. That's what people said. But a mother knows when silence is heavier than it should be. One evening, I knocked on his bedroom door. I remember the sound of my knuckles against the wood. I remember how long it took him to answer. When he finally opened the door, his eyes looked older than his face. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded too quickly. That was the moment I should have pushed harder. I know that now. But back then I believed in respecting closed doors. I believed privacy was kindness. That belief would cost us more than I understood at the time. The real turning point came years later, after my husband unexpectedly died from a heart attack. One day I was a wife. The next day I was a widow trying to learn how to sleep alone in a bed that suddenly felt too large. Grief rearranges families. People step into new roles without asking. Some grow closer, some drift away. My son married not long after, a woman I didn't fully understand but tried to accept. She was confident, direct, not unkind but guarded. They had a child within 2 years, my first grandchild. Holding that baby should have been pure joy, and part of it was. But there was something else, too, a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain, a sense that I was standing on the edge of something unfinished. Then came the request. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. My son sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. I had just poured coffee. "Mom," he said, "there's something I need from you." I still remember how my stomach dropped before he finished the sentence. That was the day everything changed. I sat across from my son at that kitchen table longer than either of us realized. The coffee went untouched. The clock above the sink ticked louder than usual, or maybe I was just listening harder. He finally looked up at me. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Fear mixed with resolve. The kind that tells you a decision has already been made and you're only being informed. "Mom," he said again, slower this time, "we need help." I nodded. Of course I would help. That's what parents do, even when their children are grown and wearing responsibilities that don't fit quite right yet. He took a breath. "We're behind on the house. Just a few months, but the bank is already calling. We're trying to get ahead of it, but things stacked up faster than we expected." I waited. I knew there was more. He rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "The lawyer said if we put the house in your name temporarily, it would protect it, just until we get back on our feet." The words settled slowly. House. My name. Temporarily. I asked questions, though I can't remember all of them now. He had answers ready. Paperwork, a plan, reassurances. "It's just on paper," he said. "Nothing changes. You won't even have to do anything." I wanted to believe him, not because it sounded perfect, but because he was my son, because I had raised him, because trust doesn't disappear just because you're older. I agreed. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that families help each other, that this was temporary. Temporary is a dangerous word. It sounds harmless. It promises an end date without giving one. The paperwork moved quickly, faster than I expected. Lawyers have a way of making big decisions feel routine. I signed where they pointed. I asked if there was anything I should worry about. They smiled politely. "It's your family," one of them said. That should have been my warning. At first, nothing changed. My son called like usual. I babysat my grandchild. Holidays came and went. Life smoothed itself back into a rhythm that felt almost normal. But slowly, the phone calls became shorter, the visits less frequent. Excuses stacked up the way bills do when no one wants to open the envelopes. When I asked how the house situation was going, I got careful answers. "We're working on it. It's complicated. Let's talk about it later." Later stretched into years. I was in my late 60s when I realized something was wrong. Not just uncomfortable wrong, legally wrong. A letter arrived in the mail with my name printed in bold across the top. Property tax notice. Past due. I stared at it, confused. I hadn't owned a home in years, not like that. I called my son. He didn't answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. That night I sat at my kitchen table with that letter and the old paperwork spread out in front of me. I read everything for the first time without trusting anyone else's explanation. And that's when I understood. The house was not temporary anymore. It hadn't been for a long time, and every responsibility tied to it had quietly become mine. I felt something inside me settle. Not panic, not anger, something colder, a realization that once settles never fully leaves. When I finally confronted my son, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a long, exhausted conversation where every answer raised another question. "We thought you knew," he said at one point. I looked at him and wondered when knowing became my responsibility alone. His wife barely spoke. She sat with her arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere behind me, as if this conversation were happening to someone else. I drove home that evening in silence. The radio stayed off. I needed to hear my own thoughts, even if they weren't kind. That was the first night I understood what injustice inside a family feels like. It doesn't arrive with violence. It arrives with paperwork, silence, and the quiet assumption that you'll endure it because you always have. I didn't tell anyone, not my daughter, not my friends. I paid what I could. I made calls. I tried to untangle something that had been wrapped too tightly for too long. And still, I stayed quiet, because I believed keeping the peace was worth the cost. I was wrong again. Silence has a cost. I didn't understand how expensive it was until the bills began arriving faster than I could hide them. Every month, another envelope. Another reminder that a decision made years ago was still very much alive, still asking to be fed. Property taxes, insurance notices, maintenance issues I had never agreed to manage. I started cutting corners in my own life, nothing dramatic. Smaller groceries, fewer doctor visits, the kind of adjustments older people make without telling anyone, because we're used to being invisible that way. When my daughter noticed I'd lost weight, I told her I was eating healthier. When friends asked why I stopped joining them for coffee, I said I was tired. Tired was true, just not in the way they imagined. The house my son lived in began to need repairs, a roof leak, an aging furnace. He called me when things broke. "Since it's technically in your name," he said once, almost casually, "the insurance company wants you to handle it." That was the first time I heard the word technically used like a weapon. I paid for the repairs, not because I could afford them, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't, afraid the house would be lost, afraid my grandchild would suffer. Children have a way of anchoring you to decisions you might otherwise walk away from. I remember one afternoon in particular. I had driven over to drop off groceries and a small toy I'd picked up for my grandchild. He was 4 then, still believed the world made sense. I stood in the doorway watching him push a little truck across the floor, making soft engine noises to himself. He looked up at me and smiled. That smile carried more weight than any legal document ever could. That was the moment I understood something clearly. I wasn't paying for a house. I was paying for peace, or at least the illusion of it. The distance between my son and me grew heavier. Conversation stayed polite but shallow. When I brought up the future, he changed the subject. When I mentioned transferring the house back into his name, he said the timing wasn't right. The timing never is when delay benefits one side. His wife stopped pretending altogether. She didn't call, didn't thank me. When she spoke to me, it was with the tone reserved for someone who had become an inconvenience. I began to feel like a guest in a story that used to belong to me. It was my daughter who finally broke the silence. She came over one afternoon unannounced, arms full of groceries, irritation written all over her face. She had always been more direct than her brother. "Mom," she said, setting the bags down harder than necessary, "what's going on?" I tried to deflect, but she didn't let me. "I saw the letters," she said quietly, "the ones you hid in the drawer." That drawer. I had underestimated her, or maybe overestimated my ability to keep secrets. I told her everything, slowly, carefully, like someone confessing to a crime they didn't know they were committing at the time. She didn't interrupt. She didn't soften her expression. When I finished, she said, "This isn't help. This is exploitation." The word landed hard. Exploitation. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend my son, but the truth has a way of standing up for itself. Family gatherings changed after that. Conversations grew tense. My daughter asked questions my son refused to answer. The grandchild felt it even if he didn't understand it. Children always do. I watched my family split into quiet sides, not openly hostile, but no longer united. And still I stayed in the middle. Still I paid. Still I believed that endurance was the same thing as love. It took a health scare to change that. The night I collapsed in my kitchen, I thought of many things. My husband, my children when they were small, the maple tree outside. But mostly, I thought of how tired I was of carrying something that had never truly been mine to begin with. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to machines hum softly, I made a decision I should have made years earlier. I would stop being quiet. When I got home from the hospital, things felt different. I had survived, yes, but something else had shifted. A quiet determination that had been sleeping inside me for decades. I began with the paperwork. I went through every letter, every notice, every bill that had piled up in my absence. I documented everything. Dates, amounts, names. I made copies. I organized it not because I wanted to fight my family, but because I finally wanted to understand what had happened. The next step was inevitable. My son had to see me. My daughter had to see me. And somehow, my grandchild needed to know that I wasn't just a passive bystander in their lives. I called my son one morning. The phone rang and rang. Finally, a familiar voice answered, cautious. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked. "No," I said. "It's not. We need to talk. In person." There was a long pause. Then, "Fine, this weekend." I knew that weekend would be the turning point. I knew it could go badly, but I also knew it couldn't go any worse than years of silence and half-truths. When we met, the tension in the room was palpable. My grandchild played quietly in the corner, building a tower of blocks, oblivious to the storm brewing nearby. My son sat across from me, hands folded, avoiding my gaze. His wife perched stiffly on the couch, lips pressed tightly together. I spoke first, calmly. "I've kept quiet for too long. I've paid for things I shouldn't have had to pay for, and I've stayed silent when I should have spoken." My son shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I thought you understood. I thought you trusted me." I did. I do. But trust isn't permission to take advantage of someone. It isn't permission to make decisions that affect my life without my understanding. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. His wife finally spoke. "We didn't want a fight. We didn't want drama. I didn't want drama either, but this isn't drama. This is reality. You made a choice years ago that affected me, and I've been living with it silently. That ends now." For hours, we went through every document, every past conversation, every missed opportunity to set things right. My son tried to justify, to explain, to soften, but the truth has a way of cutting through excuses. I didn't yell, I didn't cry much, I just spoke, clearly and slowly, about what had happened, what had been lost, and what needed to be corrected. By the end of the day, decisions were made. The house would be transferred back, the bills would be addressed fairly, and my relationship with my grandchild, that would not be compromised by mistakes made by the adults in the room. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control, of justice, of acknowledgement. That night, I sat on my front porch, listening to the wind in the maple tree. I thought of my husband. I thought of my children as they were, as they are, and as they would become. I realized that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about clarity, honesty, and finally, speaking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it's about leaving a legacy for the next generation, a grandchild who learns that silence can carry weight, but speaking up carries freedom. I smiled softly. I felt the years fall away, the burdens lightening. The past had its scars, yes, but the future could still be gentle if we chose to make it so. The weeks after the confrontation were strange, quiet in a way I hadn't expected. The tension that had been sitting like a weight over the house seemed to lift, almost imperceptibly, but it didn't disappear entirely. Silence can't vanish overnight. It softens, shifts, becomes something else. My son began taking responsibility for the house again, slowly, carefully. Calls to the insurance company, arranging repairs, paying bills on time. It was tedious work, but I watched it like a hawk, not out of distrust, but because years of unspoken problems had taught me to notice everything. His wife softened too, not completely, but enough to allow me to see glimpses of who she had been before frustration and resentment settled in. I realized that much of the tension had been about fear of confrontation, fear of admitting mistakes, fear of losing face. And my grandchild, my beautiful little grandchild, began to see me not just as the quiet grandmother who arrived with gifts and stories, but as someone who stood up, finally, for what was right. There was a new respect in their eyes, though innocent and unspoken. Children notice the smallest shifts. Over time, the house situation stabilized. The legal paperwork was corrected, returned to its rightful ownership, and for the first time in decades, I could close that chapter without feeling a knot in my stomach. But life is rarely so clean. Old habits, old misunderstandings, old wounds, they linger. There were dinners where voices rose a little higher than they should have, conversations where old accusations surfaced as though the air itself remembered the past. I learned to accept it, that healing isn't linear, that relationships, especially family relationships, are messy, fragile, and resilient all at once. One evening, I sat on the porch again, watching the maple tree sway in the wind. My daughter joined me, and for the first time in years, we shared a cup of tea in silence. Comfortable, unhurried silence. No one needed to fill the air with words. The air itself seemed to breathe with relief. "You were brave," she said softly. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us." I smiled, thinking about all the years I had spent keeping quiet, thinking that endurance was strength. I had been wrong. Strength wasn't staying silent. Strength was speaking, even when it frightened you. Strength was setting boundaries and teaching the next generation that justice doesn't always come in dramatic moments. It comes in clarity, honesty, and courage. The grandchild grew up knowing that families can be complicated, that parents can make mistakes, that love doesn't erase responsibility, and standing up for yourself doesn't mean you stop loving. I tell this story now not as a warning, not as judgment, but as memory, a gift to anyone who will listen. A reminder that life is long, that mistakes can be corrected, and speaking your truth is never too late. I have lived a long life. I have felt joy, grief, pride, and regret. But above all, I have learned this: quiet endurance is not always virtuous. Truth and justice, however delayed, are worth more than years of silence. And now, sitting here, watching the wind in my maple tree, I finally feel at peace. After the confrontation, life didn't instantly become perfect. Family dynamics don't heal like cuts that can be bandaged. They heal like rivers carving through stone, slowly, over time, sometimes unpredictably. My son began to visit more regularly, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. There was a new respect in his voice when he spoke to me, a recognition of the mistakes he had made and the weight I had carried quietly for years. We didn't talk about the house anymore. The legal matters were settled. But the lessons lingered in the small gestures, in the effort he now made to involve me in his life. My daughter remained close. She had always been my confidant, but now our bond deepened. She would sit with me in the evenings, drinking tea, sharing memories. Sometimes we laughed at old mistakes, sometimes we cried, but always we spoke honestly. The grandchild, my little anchor, grew older. I watched them take their first steps, speak their first words, ride their first bike, and in each milestone, I realized something essential. The struggles of adults do not define the innocence of children, yet they are shaped quietly by what they witness. I began telling stories to the grandchild, carefully, stories not of shame, but of truth, stories of love, mistakes, and courage. I didn't sugarcoat life, I didn't hide the hard lessons, but I told them in a way that nurtured empathy, awareness, and resilience. It was in these moments I realized the true power of what I had endured. Not the bitterness of being taken advantage of, but the ability to shape the next generation with honesty and courage. Yet not everything mended perfectly. My son and his wife occasionally argued over minor things. Old habits die hard. Some resentment lingered, though unspoken. My daughter sometimes shook her head at their behavior, and I quietly acknowledged that family, even in its healing, remains imperfect. I accepted this. Imperfection is human, family is messy, and justice, I understood now, does not always mean punishment. It often means clarity, accountability, and the courage to speak your truth. I spent hours on the porch, watching seasons change. The maple tree I planted when my first child was born now cast shadows across the lawn. Its leaves whispered reminders that time moves forward, whether we are ready or not. In those moments, I reflected on my choices, my endurance, and my late courage. I realized that the long silence had taught me patience, but the eventual confrontation had taught me something greater, that it is never too late to claim your voice. Neighbors often asked how I managed to stay so calm through all the family turmoil. I would simply smile and say, "Patience is important, but so is speaking the truth." It became my mantra, a quiet kind of justice that rippled through the family, shaping relationships in subtle but meaningful ways. Now, as I sit in my home at 78, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the heater, I often think about the life I've lived. I think about the choices I made, the mistakes I tolerated, and the courage I found far too late. The house on the other side of town is finally cared for by my son. He calls more often now, not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. His wife has softened, though some habits remain. My daughter and I continue our evening teas, sharing memories and lessons in equal measure. And my grandchild? Well, they've grown into a thoughtful, sensitive soul. I see glimpses of the person they will become and know that the honesty I finally embraced shaped them in ways I will never fully see. I have come to understand that life is never perfectly fair. We cannot control the choices others make,
We cannot dictate the consequences that ripple through time, but we can control how we respond. I chose to respond with courage, even if delayed. I chose to speak, even if it caused discomfort. I chose to demand accountability, not vengeance. And in that choice, I found a sense of justice that wasn't about punishment. It was about truth, clarity, and love for those still learning the lessons I had learned. Sometimes the memories are bittersweet. I think of my husband, gone too soon, who would have wanted me to stand firm. I think of the years I spent silently carrying burdens that weren't mine alone. I think of my children learning from mistakes and growing from consequences. And yet, I smile, because despite the mistakes, the misunderstandings, and the injustices endured, we remain a family, flawed, human, but still together in ways that matter most. I tell this story now not for sympathy, not for recognition, but for anyone who will listen. Family life is complicated, yes. Injustice can arrive quietly, disguised as trust or temporary favors, but the voice you carry, even if late, can change the course of relationships. You can shape the legacy you leave, and sometimes the act of finally speaking your truth is the greatest gift you can give the people you love and yourself. The maple tree in my front yard sways in the wind, golden leaves drifting to the ground. Each leaf is a reminder of seasons past, of time endured, of life lived fully with all its messiness and grace. I lean back in my chair and close my eyes, finally at peace. Because justice is not always a loud victory. It is the quiet knowledge that you stood for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it was late. And that, perhaps, is enough. The final years of my life have been quiet, but in a good way. There is a rhythm to these days that feels earned, shaped by the storms I survived and the truths I finally spoke. I watch my grandchild grow. They ask questions, sometimes about schools, sometimes about life, sometimes about me, and I answer honestly, without sugarcoating or hiding the hard lessons. I tell them about patience, endurance, mistakes, and courage. I tell them that families are complicated, that people can hurt each other unintentionally, and that speaking the truth, even when scary, can heal more than silence ever could. My children have changed too. My son carries the weight of his past decisions differently now. He is more thoughtful, more patient, more aware of the ripple effects of choices. My daughter, ever perceptive, guides gently but firmly. And through it all, there is respect for me, for each other, and for the truth we all carry in our hearts. The house that caused so much silent struggle is no longer a source of tension. Repairs are made promptly. Responsibility is shared fairly. The past is acknowledged, but no longer lingers like a shadow over our lives. I often sit on the porch in the evenings watching the maple tree sway in the breeze. Its branches are taller than I imagined, its leaves golden in the sunlight. I planted that tree when my first child was born, and I realize now that life is a lot like that tree. It grows taller, stronger, and wiser through storms, even when the path seems uncertain. I think of the lessons I've learned, that endurance alone is not always virtue, that silence can be a burden as heavy as any loss, that courage is often quiet and delayed, but its impact is lasting, that love and justice can coexist if we choose honesty over convenience. And so I leave this story for my family and for anyone who will listen, not as a warning, not as judgment, but as a memory and a guide, to remind them that mistakes are human, but truth and responsibility are timeless. I do not know how long I will have left, perhaps a few years, perhaps longer, but I know this: I lived, I endured, I spoke, and I left a legacy. And sometimes that is all a person can hope for. The wind rustles through the maple tree one last time tonight, golden leaves drifting down like quiet applause. I smile. Life, with all its mistakes, regrets, and hard-won lessons, has finally come full circle. And now, at last, I am at peace.